All right, let's take a look at lesson 12 from unit 6. And we're looking at tangent ratio. We've been talking about sine and cosine, and now we're taking a look at tangent. So 12.1, notice and wonder, an unusual function. So what do you notice and what do you wonder about this table? All right, so now we're going to take a look at 12.2, and we're looking at that table again, but it's a little bit longer here. And so we're going to complete the table for each positive angle in the table and add the corresponding point and segment between it to the origin, and the origin to the unit circle. All right, so let's take a look at the first one. We've got negative pi over 2, and we know that that is here. And our cosine is 0 and sine is -1. Now remember that tangent of theta is the same thing as sine of theta over cosine of theta. So we can take our -1 and divide by 0. Uh-oh, can we do that? We cannot do that. That's undefined. So we're going to write undefined. That means undefined. Actually, we'll put undefined there. And for the rest of them, if there are more undefined, we'll just put UND. So that one is undefined because you can't divide by 0. All right. The next one is negative pi over 3. So that's going to be like over here. And so then we're going to do negative 0.87 divided by 0.5, and we get negative 1.74, right? And these are all approximations except for the 0.5. All right, then we're going to do negative pi over 6, which is about right here. And we've got negative 0.5 divided by 0.87. So we have about negative 0.57. All right, and then we have 0 divided by 1, because that's here at the starting point. And we have 0, because you can divide 0 by other numbers. You just can't divide by 0. All right, and then we have pi over 6, which is up here, and that is 0.5 divided by 0.87, and so we get positive 0.57. Then we have pi over 3, which is about right here, and that is 0.87 divided by 0.5, so we have 1.74. Then we have pi over 2 right here, and that's 1 divided by 0, which we can't do, so that's undefined. And then we have 2 pi over 3, which is about right here. And we know that 2 pi over 3 has the same values as pi over 3, but our x value is negative. So it has the same x and y values, but the x is negative because we're in the second quadrant. And so we're just taking that 1.74 and making it negative because a positive divided by a negative is negative. And we could put that negative in there if you want to. All right, then negative 5 pi over 6 is again in the same, or that second quadrant. Okay. So 5 pi over 6. So that's going to be the same as pi over 6, but again, your x is negative and your y is positive. And so your ratio is going to be the same but negative because you have a positive divided by a negative. Then we have pi over here. And we know that at pi, we have cosine is -1. That's our x value, and our sine is 0. And we can do 0 divided by -1. And we get 0. Then 7 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6 is going to be right about here. And again, that's going to be the same as pi over 6. But we're in the third quadrant, so everything is negative. So we have negative 0.87. And I'm just getting this from up here. I don't have to redo all of that work. And since they're both negative, a negative divided by a negative is a positive. So that tangent is positive. And we did talk about that previously. Now 4 pi over 3, that's going to be about here. And that is the same thing as pi over 3, but both the x and the y are negative. So now we're looking here at 0.5, and that's negative, and negative 0.87. And then when you divide them, you get positive 1.74, because a negative divided by a negative is positive. And then here we had 3 pi over 2, which actually was the same thing as negative pi over 2. We know that's 0 and negative 1, and you cannot divide by a 0, so that is undefined. And then we have 5 pi over 3 over here, which is actually the same thing as negative pi over 3. And our values are the same as pi over 3. So we have 0.5, and we're in the fourth quadrant, so that's positive. But then our y value is going to be negative. And then when we find our ratio, it's going to be negative because a negative divided by a positive is a negative. And then we have 11 pi over 6 here, which is the same as negative pi over 6. So we have a positive 0.87. We have a negative 0.5 because we're in the fourth quadrant. And then our tangent ratio is negative 0.57. And then 2 pi is the same thing as 0. So we have 1, 0, and our ratio is 0. All right, so how are the values of tangent of theta like the values of cosine theta and sine theta? All right, so they're the same. I mean, the values aren't the same, but they're like those two because they do keep repeating themselves, right? So the values repeat. To create a periodic function. How are they different? Well, if you look at the minimum value is 0. The minimum, actually, no, it's not. Sorry. The minimum value, there isn't one because it looks like it's negative 1.74, but it actually continues going on. So actually, we're not going to write that down, but we can talk about it. And then there's also not a maximum because it keeps on going forever. But there are places where it's undefined, and that is not true for sine and cosine. So there are values that are undefined. And you don't get that with sine and cosine. All right, and then let's take a look at 12.3. We're not going to graph it just yet. We will take a look at the graph soon, but not yet. But we are going to figure some things out that might be true. So explain why the graph of tangent has a vertical asymptote at pi over 2. So remember that here in our table, pi over 2 is here. And what do you notice about the tangent value? That tangent value is undefined, right? And so it has an asymptote at pi over 2 because it's undefined. Again, remember that tangent of theta is sine of theta over cosine of theta. So that means that the tangent of pi over 2 is equal to the sine of pi over 2 over the cosine of pi over 2. And that's the same thing as 1 over 0, which is undefined. And so anytime you have a cosine of 0, you're going to have that asymptote because it can't equal that value. All right, does the graph of tangent of theta have other vertical asymptotes? So we know pi over 2, but where else is cosine equal to 0, right? What values of theta are at 0? Well, theta is 0 for cosine when you have pi over 2 plus any of those full rotations, but also pi over 2, well, 3 pi over 2, I should say. Because remember, in that on the unit circle, we have all of those values down there on the y-axis where your cosine is 0. So for which values of theta is tangent of theta 0? So remember, we can't divide by 0, but we can divide 0 by something else. So whenever the sine is 0, then tangent is 0. And so what values are sine 0? Well, sine of theta equals 0 when theta is equal to pi. Well, really 0 first. 0, pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, all the multiples of pi. So basically, n pi, where n is a whole number. And it can be, it's an integer actually, because it can be positive or negative. So this was when tangent was 0. Oops, I thought I picked up the other marker. When tangent was 0, and now when tangent is 1, so tangent of theta equals 1 when sine is equal to cosine, right? Because the only way you get 1 by dividing is by dividing the same thing by itself. So that is true at pi over 4 and at 5 pi over 4. Because if we look at our unit circle, let's bring up that unit circle. Yeah, there. All right, so if we look at our unit circle, we have the same values here at pi over 4, not over here at 3 pi over 4 because one's positive, one's negative, and not at 7 pi over 4 because, again, different signs. But here we have both negative, so 5 pi over 4 is also the case. All right, is the graph of tangent of theta periodic, right? And remember that periodic means that it keeps repeating that same pattern over and over. And so, yes, it does. And we saw that in our table up here. It kept following that same pattern. So, yes, it is. So as theta increases by 2 pi, sine and cosine take the same values, and so does tangent. All right, so as you add, as you increase by 2 pi, you start repeating. All right, and here's the lesson summary. There is a brief look at what the graph of tangent looks like, and we will talk more about that in future lessons.